G'day, g'day. Let me know how that audio is before I get started. Okay, cool. Actually, another idea that we can do, and I've done this before, is that if you want to jump on chat, we can just jump in the Discord voice chat. That way we can actually have a conversation, and I find that that works really well, but I'm cool just doing either way. Okay, cool. Let's g'day, g'day. Okay, cool. Yeah, I find that it works better having a conversation, so you can actually just ask questions in real time as opposed to the other thing. So yeah, what I wanted to do is I wanted to just go over my general thoughts on what is a study, how to study, and kind of how to get the most out of them. And I find it's something which isn't really talked about that much, or at least not talked about in a way which makes sense. And so I just wanted to go over the things that I think about when I think this. And just to give a high level view of how I kind of view an artist, and the mental mechanisms that work, is that you have your subconscious. That's badly written, but it doesn't matter. And then you have your conscious self, and they're kind of disconnected, and it's not the actual way the brain works, but it's a useful model in thinking about learning. And so if this is your and what happens when we're drawing is that we are using our conscious self to tell our subconscious that we want to be creating something, because our subconscious has a lot more power and all the memory and all this ability to infer things about the world that we cannot possibly think about in real time. So you can think about anything your conscious self remembers is like facts, things you can memorize, and like things you can actually reason about. Whereas this is more subtle memory. So kind of like when you have all these like little tiny anatomical details, and you just can look at it and kind of know that it looks wrong. This is where Uncanny Valley lives. That thing where if you look at something that like a drawing and it looks kind of creepy, it's usually because they got so close to a human, but there's certain subtle tells that aren't there. And this all comes from the subconscious. And the thing is that the majority of your drawing skill actually comes from your subconscious. And so if you were to get someone who's freaking incredible at drawing, and you only kept their conscious self and swapped off a beginner's subconscious, they might be able to, like, this is this weird thought experiment, but they wouldn't be able to just get up straight away and be able to draw, because they have all these years of trained subconscious that is propping them up. So when you got Kim Jong-gi drawing, he's using his subconscious to pull on and do all the heavy lifting of all the perspective. Like, he can look at a cube and know this is in perspective, and I know what the perspective is around it and everything around it. But there's a real, and this might all be fairly obvious, but I think what's kind of interesting here is that you only have a very shallow sort of pathway. So you can kind of think of it as your conscious self is like a little computer where you're trying to program into a mainframe, but you can only program really slowly. And so you can kind of almost think of it as you're trying to change the course of a massive, slow-moving ship, and it just takes time, and it takes repetition to be able to do it. So it's a sort of thing where when we're studying, if we keep this in mind, that we're using our conscious self to train our subconscious, so that when we come to the problem later, the subconscious will do it automatically and without effort, because anything you do in the conscious self takes effort. Anything in the subconscious tends to be you get for free. You don't get burnt out. You don't get tired. It just happens. And so when you see someone like anyone just drawing effortlessly without thinking, and they're just like throwing jokes off, and you probably think, oh, how the hell are they doing that? They're showing any mental effort. It's because they already trained their subconscious to do it. Does that all make? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so if we have this in mind, that this is our mental model of how we're thinking about things, and it's very simple, of course, but we can start to think about studying in a different way. And I'll bring in another concept. And in learning, there's a concept known as cognitive load. And the idea of cognitive load is that, let's say you're trying to learn something, and let's graph it. Let's say that this is difficulty. What would the other axis be? So, and amount learned. And what they've found is that when you're studying, if this was going up with the amount, like let's say you're upping the difficulty in how much you learn in a session, and what they find is that once you've reached some certain amount, the amount learned actually tapers off, and you actually learn almost nothing, because you only can really take in so much in a lesson. Otherwise, your brain gets overloaded and it can't do the statistical inference that it normally does. And so what we're trying to do when we're studying is we're trying to get as close to this point as possible without going over the cliff. And I'm sure you found that when you're studying that you've pushed yourself really hard, you've burnt yourself out, and you're like, well, what the hell did I learn from that? I think it's very easy to do that. But that's and so now if we think about, okay, I want to learn how to, let's say, draw something in perspective. And there's a few different approaches you could take to that. Number one, you could try and draw an entire scene. So like you might start out and you go, oh, I'm going to draw a city. I'm going to start drawing all these buildings and all this sort of stuff. And you'll go a long way, and you'll probably not do a great job at the start because you haven't really done it much. But you probably won't also learn anything, because an important part of learning is actually that you have some ability to measure how well you did at the activity. And so if we're going to make some rules of studying that make sense with how this stuff works, is that the first rule is a study needs to be testable. Yeah, welcome. Yep. Yeah, I probably missed the start of this, but we'll keep going. But yeah, so the rules of a study is the first thing you need is for it to be testable. And what do I mean by that? Let's say you're doing a copying study, and you copy an image. So let's say it's like a portrait or something. And you could do your copy where it's like whatevs. Well, you actually don't learn that much just doing this activity. What you actually learn from is by getting this final thing and doing an analysis of what you did wrong. And you can do that in different ways. You can either get out a ruler, or you can or you can drag the thing over the original and turn it on and off. And what you'll find there is your brain is suddenly able to go, okay, this is what I thought, and this is what's actually there. And you make this loop where your brain is basically going, I thought this thing, this is what it's not. And as soon as you give your brain evidence that the subconscious did not understand the thing correctly, cogs start moving, and your brain actually starts to catch up with it. And if you repeat this process over and over again, what you'll find is that your study gets closer and closer to what this was. But the reason why that's happening is you had this testability phase. And I think it's really invisible for a lot of people because they do this testability phase in their head as they're drawing. And so you can make it an explicit thing where you're literally moving your thing over the top and testing it. Or you could have already learnt a bunch of skills such as proportion, angles, all this sort of analysis that you can do in your head. And if you've done that, you can actually do that testability phase inside of your head. But if you're not doing that, you're not going anywhere. And so whenever I'm talking about in the chat that gesture is kind of a waste of time for beginners, the reason why I'm saying that is that when you're doing a gesture as a beginner, the idea of a gesture is amorphous. You don't have anything which is like, this is a good gesture, I know what I'm aiming for. And so when you're interpreting a photo in this wildly creative way, you don't actually have anything to mark yourself on. You're not giving yourself testability parameters. And so when you're just doing these drawings and you're throwing them out there, and because you're not doing that testability phase, you're not actually making any improvement. You're just doing a shitty gesture, doing another one, doing another one. And so that's why we recommend that when you start out doing this, focus on proportion and accuracy, because that will give you the toolkit to have that testability framework for when you're doing a study. Just checking in, does that all make sense? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And as you get better at those proportion or those objective things, I mean, they're not really objective, but the things that your brain can pick up on. And so if we can put it into like what's a good study and what's a bad study, it's about what you can actually drive as good or bad. And you can also think of this, like this doesn't need to be just like fundamentals and facts. You can also think about it as like, you might have a very specific art taste and you might like, let's say 80s pulp art, and there might be some aesthetic that you really like there. You can use that as your testability criteria. You can basically say, is this thing that I made closer or further away from this thing that I love? And you can use that as testability criteria. Because what I'm outlining here isn't about how to learn fundamentals. It's just simply how to train the subconscious to pick up on these things and move forward. And so you can do things like, if you're making an illustration, you can literally just have another illustration that has the qualities that you want in it. And you can look at it and you can ask yourself, does my painting have these qualities? Why not? But the important part there is that you actually have the thing on screen and you're asking yourself these questions directly. Because it might seem like, oh, you're just doing this stuff in your head, it's not important, but it's super freaking important. And if you actually have an image on this to compare against, you can make it actually objective, and you can start to actually like write down a list of things. And so an activity to get into this habit is, once you do a study and you've got the reference, literally have a list of like write out a list of things you did well and things you did badly and things you could have done better next time. And usually it's a good idea to try that again after you've made that list. So you're saying something? Let me guess, the list got pretty long, right? Which one? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly the right thing to do. Because now you're basically giving yourself that feedback loop where you can train that subconscious. And anyways, honestly, like that's the meat of what I wanted to cover. but we can go into actually talking about some more specific things, because it's talking about it all in the like major generalities. So I think the next thing to talk about then is, let's say you want to learn a very difficult skill, one where you actually can't find a testability parameter. Well, what's the next thing we need to think about is, how do we split the actual skill up into small segments that we can actually understand? And is there a way to, like, even though when they're together we can't actually have a testability framework, but can I have a testability framework of them separately, so that when I go into this space where I can't test it, can I actually succeed? And so I think that's important. So I'll give you a very concrete example. So it's taken me, I think, probably like over a decade to learn how to draw faces in a way that's aesthetic, in my opinion. But the thing which actually got me over the line to a point where I didn't hate my faces anymore, and when I liked them, is that, well, let me explain the problem first. I would always practice faces, always in perspective, and it's all well and good. So just whatever, just always doing this. And the problem with that, when you're trying to learn about faces, is that I was always forcing myself to, every single time I'm doing this, consider perspective, consider expression, consider color. Basically, I'm giving myself too many variables. Yeah, way too many variables. And I'm somebody, I can draw pretty confidently in perspective. I could just draw, like, bad example, but I'm pretty decent at foreshortening. I can do it without really thinking most of the time. But the thing is, though, is even if you can do that, you're still paying a mental cost from it, even if it's unseen. And so what I did was I made a Pinterest board, and I'll probably link to it. And it was just faces in profile. And it might seem weird for somebody who can draw in perspective, who hammers down on Riley method and Bridgman and all this sort of stuff, to basically sit down and for 3 to 6 months draw nothing but faces in profile. But what I found was that when I removed this cognitive load from the perspective, well, suddenly I could actually start to reason about things. And you can start to notice shapes in a way that you can't really notice when you're overloaded. So basically, my problem with faces was I was constantly cognitively overloading myself, meaning that I was focusing on the wrong areas. I was always focusing on, how do I draw this face better in perspective, rather than how do I draw a diverse range of people and have like proportions that make sense. And when we have been looking at, like, in a simplified way, well, one thing which is really interesting is, what is the difference between, let's say, an Asian face and a Caucasian face? And there's actually something you can pick up on, which is really simple if you're paying attention here. So what I noticed here, and this is more just a lesson of something which I learned from doing this, was that if you wanted to draw an Asian face, they actually have a line that pretty much goes from the eye, runs through the corner of the nose, and goes here. Whereas Caucasian faces actually have this more of a triangle. And that's something that you can start to notice if you can simplify the space. So where's a sample? So in this face, for example, see how there's like this triangle? And so anything you're studying, you should be thinking about, how do I simplify and make this sort of less cognitive effort in the areas I don't care about, so I can use my brain to focus on the areas I do care about. So, like, do you guys have any questions there, or or do you guys actually have a pretty good idea about how you'd apply that? Yeah. Yeah, I think my big lesson for this one was that even if I can draw really hard things, it's actually not the best way to study by always doing the hard things I can do. And it's like you shouldn't be maxing out your skill all the time. Rather, you should be trying to find what is a different way I can study the same thing that I've studied before. And I think it's more important to have a massive variety in the way of studies. So, like, I wouldn't recommend to just do the faces and profile thing. That is a single way to study that will give you a perspective on certain aspects of the skill set. Doing box studies is another way you can do it, and you'll learn a different set of skills. And really, you should be doing these things both in tandem, or you should like drill one at a time intermittently, because you're going to learn different things by drilling down on the subject or also doing that cross-referencing. So another like a way you could do this is, let's say you're doing the faces in profile. I could say try and come up with an interesting face. And then you could say, well, now I've actually designed this face. I've got kind of a map of the aesthetics of it. Well, now I want to draw that exact same face in perspective. And now I'm using my initial drawing as the testing parameters for my second drawing, and holding myself to account that what I am actually drawing this second time is in fact the same forms that I drew the first time. And it's holding yourself to that actual thing that you're going to sit down and draw the same thing from a different angle, or reinterpret it in a different way, but it's still being recognizable. That's super important. Okay, so for example, I've drawn this face too short, so because we look here, it's halfway point, and I draw it too wide. And a lot of the time you're trying to focus on, does this actually feel like what I see? So this needs to be longer. It's why one of the best things that Disney did when they had the school was that they forced people to draw on model. And what that meant was that you got out of this space of where you're trying to create everything and design everything every single time. And you go into the space where it's, okay, now somebody else has drawn a design, they've imagined these shapes, I need to work out how these shapes work and do them exactly the same as them every single time. And I think that lets you start to think about this movement between different spaces. So it's a common problem in animation. Like I know you said, however you say that, is with animators is trying to draw the same character from every angle, and that's something that it's actually a skill set that a lot of 2D guys don't have, especially concept artists. Because if you think about what a concept artist is doing, they are constantly designing new things, and they're not forced to draw it from every angle. And so animators tend to have this skill set that a lot of illustrators don't, even if they can paint to a really high level. And there's one thing to be able to paint a realistic face, but it's another thing to be able to paint that realistic face again and again and again, with it being the same face over and over again. Anyways, I'm kind of rambling at this point, but I think I got to the core of the message I wanted to talk about. Is there anything else that you guys would like me to cover while I'm on? Well, okay. Well, what are you working on right now then? Yep. Yep. Let me just have a think. Let me just go have a look back through Sketchdump and see if there's some things I can comment on. Yep. Yeah. Okay. So, whoops. Nudity, can't have that on Twitch. Okay. Yeah. Well, we got a not safe for work channel here, so it's not too bad. Okay, so how about let's talk about relative proportions. I think that's an interesting subject. Have you learned anything about relative proportions? No, 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 no. So what I mean by relative proportions is that instead of measuring things objectively, so for example, you're doing an amount of heads. I never think about the amount of heads that I'm using, and instead I use something called relative proportions. And what that is basically measuring off parts of the body and relating them to other parts. So for example, your foot is the exact same size as from your elbow to your wrist. Um, your your elbow will be about the line with your actual navel. Your head, uh, like your shoulders, will usually be two heads across. And the reason why I care about these is I think that's a lot closer to what the brain's actually doing in measuring proportions. And you'll find that actually a lot of these proportions hold up even when you go to extreme proportions like chibi and that sort of thing. Um, or you can start to use other different relative proportions when you get there as an alternative that the brain actually looks at and interprets in a way that makes sense. And I prefer it because you become very sensitive to the relationships within the drawing rather than doing this measuring thing where you're going, that's incorrect because this is the wrong amount of heads tall. Because you should be able to make a drawing where you have extreme proportions that actually feel fairly decent. So and it's also like easier to think about, do these shoulders feel like it's two heads across in perspective? Oh, oh yeah, there's about 10 seconds lag between it. That's why. Yeah, sorry about that. The recording will be perfectly synced. Yeah, so when I'm doing something like this, I'm not thinking about how many heads tall is this. I'm thinking about these specific relationships, and so and I'll point out that the major ones that I think about. So if I was to draw a body from the front, so usually I think about the pivot points from your actual hip joints. That's going to be about the same as your shoulders. And so if you think about that one, is that if you sit on the ground on your butt and you bring your knees up to your shoulders, that's actually going to be the same distance across. And then you have this navel that sits on line with the top of your hips. So if you know where your hip bones are, you can pretty much draw where the navel is. And you're always going to find that your actual elbows align with that, and your wrists are going to be at the bottom of the buttocks. And you can measure these on your body. I think it's easier to memorize them if you can think about them in relation to your own body. And what's cool about this though is you can start to think about how do these different proportions and the variations from these things make me feel? So for example, if you wanted to make someone feel like a great ape, all you do is you go, okay, the elbow needs to be lower than the navel now. So if I wanted to make this feel like an ape lady, you make the arms longer in relation to that. And so you suddenly go for different relative proportions, like coming down to the knees, for example, might be something which is a bit more great ape-ish. And you can kind of relate that emotional feeling to that you get from that different proportion to that different feeling, or so that different relative proportion. And that's something you don't really get from these exacting like head height things, because you're going to go in there and you're going to try and do a head height and go, okay, what exactly does it? What's the proportions of a gorilla? And now you're forcing yourself to try and memorize different species, like in terms of a numerical measure. It's like like trying to remember 20 phone numbers, right? It's not fun. And so I'm proposing this as a way to think about proportion in a way that works better with design and it is easier to memorize, and it's also easier to play with. And I think you'll find that very few people who are actually working in the field actually measure out how many heads tall something is. It's more that they know how specific proportions feel and how others don't. And you can also do like extreme proportions and get away with it. Like, it doesn't really matter as long as you have the relative proportions. So let's say we're going to like do like a Hulk sort of dude. So those proportions work perfectly fine, but they have a very different feeling, and it's not. And we shouldn't be thinking about proportions about whether they're correct or incorrect, but rather, how do these proportions make me feel, and how do they differ from another thing which makes you feel a different way? And so you're starting to think about this in a design sense, and you can start to think about stuff like, does this proportion make somebody look like more like a witch or more like a sneaky banker or something? It's like you can start to relate proportions and shapes to communication. And I think that's a really deep idea, because it's like it goes away from this thing of proportions being, oh, you're memorizing numbers, and rather you want to memorize, how does this thing look, and how does it make me feel, and what does modifying those proportions give me, and how subtle can I be with this proportion? And you can start to think about shapes as like, if I make the shapes more pointy, how does that make me feel? Does that make the character look more evil, or does it just make it look more zany and edgy? So like, you could think of Hades from Hercules being all edgy, or you could go for a different interpretation of edgy, where it's like Yu-Gi-Oh, where everyone's got like super pointy things, and they're using the same sort of shape language in different ways to communicate different things. And that's kind of what you want to try and memorize rather than head heights. I'll see if I can find a reference like for relative proportions on the body, because that might be interesting. Yeah, I might have to do some research to see if I can find anything, because all these ones are I've learned over the years. Yeah, potentially. Potentially not. Yeah. Do you think it's something that you could pick up though? Yeah, that's good. So yeah, I think that's something to focus on. Another thing that you can work on with this relative proportion stuff is that doing just simple constructions to work out how long should something be. So if I know that the elbow is going to be in line with the navel, well, I know where this pivot point is, and I know exactly what that range of motion is. And so you can actually construct a semicircle and work out where is that elbow going to be in any point in space. And that's the cool thing about relative proportions is that even though you're memorizing them in a specific pose, you can construct them into a different pose. And so like when I was talking about the faces and profile thing, that was another relative proportion thing where it's well, those where just noticing that having this line here will make the face actually feel Asian. Whereas doing something like this would be a lot more Western. And it's like kind of interesting in the sense that you can look at people with no Asian heritage at all, and I ask why do they look more Asian, and it's simply a proportion thing, and within the statistical distribution of how people grow. But in terms of the testability thing for the proportions, your testability criteria here is does this feel like what I want it to feel? And that's a weird thing to get your head around because you're starting to now think about this studying idea and going out of the realm of copying into the realm of design and starting to use a testability framework of communication, feeling, and yeah, and it's kind of a weird abstract way to think about it. But I know for a fact that thinking about it in this way has helped me a lot because as soon as I started thinking about um, does this feel like what I want it to be? And if it's not, why is it not? You start to analyze your own drawings and doing studies on your own drawings, even without doing something else, because your brain, like you're full of experiences, and you can kind of use this sort of uncanny valley in your head where that this doesn't feel like what I want, to force yourself to go, well, what would look like what I want? And you can go out there looking for actual reference. And I think that spending a lot of time on Pinterest and looking at references and trying to curate an aesthetic for what you want is actually a really important thing. And you can do stuff like, okay, I want to design an art style, but it's never existed before. So what you can go out and you can just find any sort of photo, doesn't matter what it is, it just has to have the vibe of what you actually want, or at least in the direction. And you get this collection together and you start now working backwards and going, okay, what is it about these things that I like so much? And how do I abstract these into a thing that I can draw? And I think that's how you can start to innovate and start to come up with things that people have never seen before. Because that's an important part of this. Is like, well, once you learn all your fundamentals and once you learn how to draw stuff basically, how do you get to that next point where I'm inventing new stuff, where I'm coming up with new ideas, new techniques, new these sort of things? I think you just need to put yourself into this mindset that you can study as a mindset. It's not a thing you do so much, but it's a way you think about drawing because you're always studying because you always have this testability framework. It's just at the start you need to have a very explicit testability framework because you don't have this subconscious built up to support you. And so you need to start out very simply and basic, and give yourself very basic tasks that you can fucking destroy, excel at. It's like it's training wheels on a bike. You don't move up to a full bicycle until you can ride on the training wheels, because that gives you the confidence to know what it feels like to ride a bike. It lets you know that like when you use these mechanisms, it's going to work, and when you remove them, you can go freely. But once you jump on a full push bike, that doesn't mean you're still not learning. You're just learning based on previous experiences that you've already built up. It's foundational knowledge in a way that you can move on from. Yeah, I think that's probably enough stuff to cover for now, but I think that was pretty good. I don't know. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think you'll develop your own research style as you go. Um, One thing which I would suggest is that don't have it too like if you're doing research, don't have too solid an idea of what you want. Allow yourself to get sucked down rabbit holes. So it doesn't matter if you start from a Google search or a Pinterest thing. Basically, look for a specific thing, and if you find something that's like fascinating, follow that rabbit hole down and see if you come up with designs and shapes and inspiration that's more interesting than what you originally came up with. Because what I found when looking for reference, and you're trying to be overly specific, that let's say you're doing an illustration, you're like, I need a specific reference of a dude with this lighting, in this pose, in this armor. And if you're asking yourself that, you're probably going to force yourself to have to look for reference for hours, and you're going to be ignoring a whole ton of really freaking cool inspiration that you could be looking for otherwise. And I think it's so. Yeah, my advice here is just be open and follow rabbit holes, and don't expect the journey to end up where you started. You don't want to do prescriptive research where you're looking for a specific answer. You want to basically be inspired where you're finding things that it's like, that would be fucking cool to incorporate in an image. I've never seen that before. I don't know if that's helpful. For me, I just mostly get lost in Pinterest, or just like looking at so retro illustrators and that sort of stuff that drew in a different way than modern guys do. But yeah, I know I'm not the best at research. I think Devin's a lot better to talk to about that than that. But I do think that his point that yes, you should write down everything about the image beforehand, or at least like write down a plan. I think that's a really good idea, because one of the biggest problems. I just realized that I'm not looking at Transfer. So okay, there's a couple of questions. But anyways, that's my point on that. Okay, currently working building my stamina on integrating drawing to my animation mindset, since that's something I'm not used to. So okay, interesting. Animation's an interesting one, man. Let me just think about how to do that. I would say that you just want to start out simply, man. And if you're doing, don't try and do full characters with animation when you start with. I think it's way too much mental tax. And what I'd recommend here is design some really simple things. Like maybe it's a ball with legs, maybe it's something like this, and focus on like designing that thing, being able to draw it from every angle. Basically, try and make yourself a model sheet for these like very simple things, and then apply it to and try and animate it. Because I think what you want to do here is you want to make success and excelling at it as achievable as possible. It's like animating a run cycle of a ball with legs is way easier than doing an entire human, because you're not dealing with all the overlap, you're not dealing with perfect anatomy, you're just dealing with the motion. And so if you can work out what is a small way I can bring in a skill into this thing and excel at it. And that's the important point. You can't just like integrate it and do poorly and go, I did it. It's more you do simple things really well, not complex things really badly. That's the mindset you need to have. Because when you do simple things really well, you can keep on going. But yeah, it's totally possible you can study through animation. Like things you can do here is try and look at reference of how things move and do it. Like I think so Paul was actually posting some really good studies that he was doing up higher in Sketchdom. Let me find them. Because Paul's learning through that sort of stuff. And like that's so basically he just drew different frames of a thing. And so what I would suggest to study is that pick an animation loop of a motion and do these sort of breakdowns and try and work out, okay, if I was going to animate this from scratch, how would I draw this? Doesn't need to be rotoscoping. In fact, it probably shouldn't be rotoscoping. It should be analyzing the thing, working out what is the motion, and putting that into practice. What was I going to say? Also, in terms of the isolating several muscles and animating their functions, is it Ron Lemon actually has really good videos on that. I'm just going to turn my aircon on. Yeah, so you can do stuff like this, where you basically do a construction and you try and draw it from different parts. I'd say that this sort of anatomy isn't. It's probably a bit more detailed than you actually need of animation, though. So I'm not sure it's exactly going to be helpful or applicable at this point in time. I think it's more going to be learning how things look, because you're not doing painting where you actually need to put highlights and catches on every little bit of anatomy. And so when you look, there's almost no animation out there where they're anatomically correct to a point where they're drawing specific muscles, unless they're doing like a Hulk animation or something. And that's and if you were doing that, you'd have specific reference up there at the point in time. So I think trying to hold yourself to this thing that you're going to memorize how every single muscle in the body moves, I don't think it's that feasible to do that. I think it's more you should focus on what does animation do well, and also look at animations and think, what did the person that made this animation, what is the knowledge that they would have needed to do that? And so a lot of this stuff is like not just knowing how to study, but also knowing what to study. So if you were to do this sort of thing, I think you might learn a lot of stuff about how muscles work, and I think you might learn a lot about there. But I'm not sure that you're going to become a better animator for it. So I think you got to choose this path, and you got to be efficient about it, because you can't learn everything. You can't learn how to be like the world's best anatomy guy as well as being the next Yo Yoshinari. Yeah, just waiting for his next thing. Yeah, so proportion, consistency, I think that those are really important things. I think you get a lot of them. The other one is just appeal, man. I think you need to learn how to draw things that are appealing. And so what I was talking about in relating to how proportions make you feel, I think that's really important. In fact, you know what I'm going to do right now is, if you guys are around, I might do a quick study and just show you how I would how I actually would do a study, and try and put appeal into it. Let me just get. Okay, so let's say I'm going to draw this. So it depends on like how I actually want to study this. Right now, I'm just going to do more of an appeal-based sort of thing. So first thing is like looking for sort of major lines. And right now I'm trying to do these in a way that I can look across and see if I'm actually getting those proportions about right. So that's higher. Yeah, definitely. I think if you're not enjoying things, I think you're approaching it the wrong way. You should be out like a study should be the sort of thing where you're chasing this rabbit hole of knowledge down, where you are basically going, "That's fucking cool. I just noticed something about this image that I've never seen before," and you're trying to learning should be fun, and maybe that's my approach here. But you got to ask yourself that if you're not enjoying it, the question is, could you actually list what you learned from the study that you're doing? I think that's an important point. If you can't think about what is the specific things that I learned, yeah, that's not going to be fun because yeah, it's a bit of a weird one, man. I do think that so Manel, for example, was talking about how he did not enjoy drawing for a long time until he basically did this accuracy stuff that I've talked about a lot. So here's someone who's really gone through a lot of struggles I think you're going through right now, man. But he came to the other side and now is kind of addicted to drawing and he can't stop drawing because he finds it so much fun. So I think it's that the first parts can be painful because it feels like you're learning such basic stuff that it's not enjoyable. You're not really learning things that are exciting. So yeah, but also I'm not sure I'm a decent person to ask about this because keep in mind, man, I've been drawing. I've been drawing for like 16 years. I don't really have a frame of reference of what it's like to be a beginner. Yeah, so I talked about that at the start of the stream, which you might want to go back and look at. Muscle memory is a term I don't like. I always use the term subconscious because that's what's really going on. Yeah, so anyways, with this study, so one thing which I'm noticing is that there's this really nice sort of flowing motion that's coming through here. I haven't captured that at all, and my proportions are also feeling wide. And so at this point, I can ask, do these shapes feel like the thing I'm trying to draw? And that's one lens I can look at it through. I can also look at it through, are the shapes exactly the same? And I can basically drag my drawing over the top. I won't do that right now, but it's a good thing to do. But it's a good time to step back and ask yourself, did I nail it at this point before you go too far? You don't need to get to a point where it's like having to save a bad drawing because it's a study. You should be able to look at the thing to the left and actually work out, does it feel right? Anyway, so let me see if I can get that feeling in there. Because if I don't, well, I need to restart. his hips kind of jutting out. And you see how like just doing these little modifications where sitting back and looking at it is actually making the drawing feel a lot better even before I finished it. Just reading your comments. Yeah, there's going to be some studies that you don't enjoy. There's always going to be pain points, but I think the point here is that you want to try and learn how to enjoy these things. And I've always found this whole thing of enjoyment weird personally, because I find that no matter the subject, I always find it way more interesting than what I initially thought the thing was going to be. Just because things are interesting, and it's diving down the rabbit hole, you tend to learn a lot. Actually, I need to scale this entire thing down a bit. Actually, looking at it, actually, sorry, I have the proportions wrong up here. I hate the multiple erasers. Yeah, I would recommend that the speed that I'm working now, about how fast you try and go, I think this whole thing of trying to do 30-second gestures, I think it's an absolute waste of time. That's pro practice for animators who've been working in the industry for years to basically learn poses. That is the point of gesture drawing. It is not to learn how poses work, and it's not to learn how a peel works. And trying to hold yourself to the standard of a professional animator when you don't have their subconscious in your brain, it's just it's a waste of time and at best, and it's demoralizing and teaching you bad habits at worst. You shouldn't expect yourself to get every single stroke right first go. And you shouldn't expect to get every single drawing and study correct first go. It's like if I did this drawing a second time, I'd probably do way better at it. Because like once you've actually done it once, you've got a better map of how things are going, and your subconscious now it goes, okay, I failed at it this time, and I didn't capture these properties of the drawing that I wanted to first time. How can I do this better? It's like right now my torso section's feeling a bit compressed, so I'll fix that. You also see that I'm not so focusing on details right now, but it's more focusing on how do the large shapes work? Can I make that feel good? And yeah, I'll probably finish this up in a second. Okay, I'm gonna finish this up, I think. Yeah, I hope that's helpful, guys. uh, okay, I'm gonna jump off now, guys. Thanks for coming, and I'll upload this onto YouTube if you want to have a look at it again. Yep, no worries. Yep.